Last time we saw our beloved son of Krypton, it was 2006. 2 years later, Marvel would release a film called Iron Man, jump-starting a cinematic universe on a scale never seen before. It only made sense for DC to start their own cinematic universe, and it only made sense to kickstart this universe with the iconic Superman. Welcome to the Summer of Superman, and hopefully you can join me on this journey through Superman's theatrical roller coaster ride. In the previous video, I looked at Superman Returns and the 20 years of canceled projects that led up to it, which brings us to probably the most divisive section of this journey, the Snyder era. So let's look at 2013's Man of Steel. Prior to the release of Superman Returns, Warner Brothers announced a sequel with a 2009 release date, with Bryan Singer returning as director and most of the cast returning as well. However, there was never actually a screenplay written, and there were some creative differences with how to approach the sequel. Singer was interested in using Darkseid, while the writer Michael Dougherty wanted to use Brainiac. And a little editorializing here, but can someone please give us a Brainiac Superman film? He's arguably the greatest Superman villain out there, and he's always the main villain in almost every single one of these canceled projects. I need more than just the television show Krypton to get my live-action Brainiac fix. Now, they never ended up creating a script or even developing a full story for this Superman Returns sequel because Warner Brothers wasn't entirely happy with Superman Returns' performance. They said even though it was financially successful, it wasn't as successful as they thought it would be. So Warner Brothers moved Superman onto a project titled Justice League Mortal, with DJ Catrona cast as Superman, Armie Hammer as Batman, and George Miller, the famous director of the Mad Max series, was signed on to direct. However, due to a Writers Guild strike delaying the project and the success of Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight, Warner Brothers decided to focus on making individual films for the heroes rather than a Justice League film. Even though DJ Catrona never ended up playing Superman, he did go on to play the adult superhero form of Pedro in the Shazam films. Warner Brothers then were taking pitches from a bunch of different screenwriters and directors for rebooting the Superman franchise. Famous comic book writers Grant Morrison, Mark Waid, Jeff Johns, Brad Meltzer, Mark Miller all had ideas that they had pitched. However, during a brainstorming session for The Dark Knight Rises, David Goyer presented an idea to Christopher Nolan on how to bring Superman into the modern day. Nolan loved the idea and pitched it to Warner Brothers. High off the success of The Dark Knight, Warner Brothers loved the idea and hired Christopher Nolan to produce the film and David Goyer to write the film. And after consideration for many different directors, the studio settled on Zack Snyder. And Man of Steel would also be the first Superman movie since 1978 that did not feature a rendition of John Williams' iconic Superman score. Instead, they hired Hans Zimmer to create an entirely different score. But this did not hinder the film in any way, as the Zimmer score was also just as amazing. Onto the casting. Henry Cavill had previously been on Hollywood's radar for playing Superman, as he had previously been considered for the canceled J.J. Abrams project and Superman Returns before he was eventually cast in Man of Steel. Other people considered for the role include Tyler Hoechlin, who did later go on to portray Superman on the CW. You had Armie Hammer and Joe Manganiello. who was Zack Snyder's second choice after Cavill, and would later go on to be cast as Deathstroke. Granted, Deathstroke was only pretty much seen in a post-credit scene. And Henry Cavill does a great job playing Superman. However, he never truly got to shine as Clark Kent in any of the movies that he was featured in. Amy Adams was cast as Lois Lane, and she gives a great performance. However, she never truly fits the Lois Lane character, in my opinion. Kevin Costner gives a great and, in my opinion, iconic performance as Jonathan Kent. You also have Diane Lane playing Martha. You have Laurence Fishburne as Perry White. Russell Crowe was given the tough task of filling the shoes of the late, great Marlon Brando and taking up the role of Jor-El. And Michael Shannon was hired to portray the main villain of the movie, General Zod. The story of Man of Steel is actually pretty simplistic, especially when you look at most of Zack Snyder's other work. You start off with an epic Krypton chase scene leading Jor-El to launch his son into space towards Earth. And Zod getting captured after a failed coup attempt, and he gets sentenced to reconditioning. From this point forward, the Superman origin is told in a non-linear fashion. You have the modern-day story of Lois uncovering the truth and secret behind Kal-El, while also being shown scenes of Clark Kent's childhood growing up in Smallville, helping the audience to understand the morality of Superman. Eventually, Zod comes to Earth and sort of forces Superman to reveal himself to the world, and then eventually Zod tries to terraform Earth and turn it into Krypton. One very important element, in my opinion, to pay attention to might be that of the Genesis Chamber. Earlier in the film, Jor-El states that Kryptonians are born artificially with engineered purposes. And Zod, very much in the third act, continuously states that his only purpose, his sole purpose, is to protect Krypton at all costs. Ultimately, Superman is forced to kill Zod, which was a big contentious issue in the writer's room. The original version of the story actually saw Zod get sucked back into the Phantom Zone. However, Zack Snyder and David Goyer didn't find this ending satisfying and preferred the idea of making Superman kill by not giving him a choice. Christopher Nolan was against this approach, but was eventually convinced by Goyer by writing the scene where Zod's heat vision is just simply inches away from civilians, giving Superman no choice. Now, onto my personal review and thoughts. I do consider myself a Zack Snyder fan. I'm not some Snyder bro, internet troll or anything, but I do consider myself a fan. I love his directing style, and I love how big, grand, and epic he can make things feel. However, his filmography is not perfect, especially when it comes to the DCEU. Right off the bat, I will tell you, I'll give Man of Steel a thumbs up. I am a fan of this movie. Zack Snyder does a great job creating this gods among men atmosphere and mentality in this film and just in the universe as a whole. That being said, while you can feel and see the theme of hope and hopefulness throughout Man of Steel, it never feels like there's ever a light at the end of the tunnel. In other words, it never feels like the hope is ever actually going to reach our characters. Also, one of my favorite elements to any Superman story is the dynamic between Clark Kent and Superman. Superman's secret identity disguise is simultaneously the worst disguise while also being the most clever disguise. They're the same person, but they require very different personalities and nuances to make the disguise believable. And Man of Steel and the Snyderverse as a whole never gives us that element, and because of this, it always feels like something is missing from the Man of Steel. One thing I do, however, really enjoy about the Man of Steel is the action. A lot of people like to complain about it being too over the top. However, to me, it's realistic. If two godlike aliens fought in the real world in New York City, there would be this giant level of destruction. So ultimately, I think Man of Steel is another great Superman movie that isn't perfect. It just barely misses the mark of being the iconic Superman movie. And ultimately, I think Superman is an iconic character. But to me, he has never truly had that one movie that is the Superman movie. Thanks for watching this video on 2013's Man of Steel. Share your thoughts of Man of Steel in the comment section down below. And click that subscribe button and notification bell so you can join the summer of Superman as we move on to the time that he took on the Bat of Gotham and on to the Gunverse this weekend. Smash that thumbs up icon if you enjoyed this video, and always stay super.